So, hello everyone. So we're gonna get started. So it's about 9 o'clock. We just want to keep in mind of the time, and we want to try to stay on time for today, because I know yesterday we were a little bit behind. So good morning, everyone. I hope everyone had a good first day yesterday of the education conference. I would like to give a round of applause to the staff here at the Victoria Inn for their hard work for setting up everything. So I'm just going to go over the agenda for the day. So from 8 to 9, we just finished having breakfast. We're going to have an opening address from Dr. Cynthia Wesley Eskima. And then at 9:45, we're going to have a second support circle panel. And then at 11:30, discussion and input. And then from 12:30 to 1:30, we're going to have a third support circle, systems, ideas, and options with Julia Canlish. And then at 2:30, we're going to have discussion and input. And then at 3:30, we're going to have a closing address by Dr. Jean Clinton. So just as a reminder, there is no scheduled breaks. So please come and go as you please, but we ask you to be quiet during presentations and discussions. So at this time, I would like to welcome Dr. Cynthia Wesley Eskimo to begin her keynote. If we can give her a round of applause.
Good morning. Good morning to everyone. Good morning to the elders, to the youth, and I don't see any children in the room, but quite more and more frequently we have children in the room, and I think that that's a fabulous thing. I want to thank all the leadership that is here, because that's a very important part of our moving forward is having those leaders in the room with us, and the many individuals are here representing people that have remained at home. I also want to acknowledge the traditional territory, the Fort William First Nation, and the many ancestors who have met on these lands over time for trade and for maintaining good relationships with each other. And I think that, one of the things we're going to have to add to that kind of an opening is how long. And I had a meeting with the Chamber of Commerce here in town, and they said, we wonder why, these people are coming here. And I said, these people have been coming here for 11,000 years. You've only been coming here for 350. Who's the interloper here? I also want to acknowledge the earth and to thank each of you for offering daily prayers for the lands and waters that are now under siege because of economic exploitation and endless want. I ask you to think of the animals and the fish and the insects and the crawly things that make it possible for our lives to continue as well. And let us always remember to be grateful. I also wanted to share, I share a lot of stories. I wanted to share also a little story. I was at Georgian Bay, Christian Island, about 4 years ago. And I noticed that the water was exceptionally clear, and was clearer than it had been when I was there about 3 years before. And I had a fellow from India with me. If you've ever seen the Ganges River, you know why I had him standing at the shore of Georgian Bay. Anyway, I went over to Christian Island. I asked some of their elders. I said, I noticed that the water here is exceptionally clear, and they said, yes, we've been working very hard on the water. And I said, what have you been doing? And they said, we've been praying every day for it. We put down tobacco every day. And I said, well, you know what? It's having an effect. So it's something that we can do every day that doesn't take that much time out of our day, but makes it possible for the lands to be healthy. So the title of the session is Building Bridges. So I'm going to talk to you about bridges. I'm going to talk to you about some practical suggestions we might consider as we move forward. We chart our next steps on education. And we looked at implementation of the Truth and Reconciliation's calls for action. And that's what they are. People have been calling them recommendations. They're not recommendations. They're actually calls for action. It means that we have to get up and actually do something about them. And so I think that that's important. I do many talks across the country over the course of a year, probably 2 or 3 talks a month, maybe even more sometimes. And let me just tell you that the most important talk that I do is to you. There's lots of people that I spend time with, but really it's about you. And I'll tell you why. When I was young, I did a paper on the 1951 Indian Act revisions. And the thing that I took away from all of that research, I still carry a lot of it in my head, was that Andrew Paul and my grandfather, Lorenzo Big Canoe, the piece that stuck in my mind was when they said, you cannot talk to us as a federal government about giving us self-government or giving us this and that and the other. He said, because the most important thing that we will do is we will lift up the morale of the people. And that's what we all need to really focus on today, is lifting up the morale of the people. And it's happening because there's so much happening external to us, and we need to be aware of that. So I'm going to draw from my own lived experience throughout this presentation, and I'm going to draw from personal stories, and I'm going to share some perspectives on how I think we might all move forward, considering the intergenerational trauma that many of us, including our ancestors, have experienced from contact forward, and still, in far too many instances, endure. And that's a conversation that remains very important to us because it's not yet happened in every personal or community setting, and we need to have that. It's deeply relevant to the healing work, moving ahead and strengthening our nations that we're talking about when we get together here. Last night I traveled from here to Toronto with former Prime Minister Paul Martin to do a talk at the Reisman's residence in Toronto in Forest Hill. And I was in a house I'd never been, the whole house, this was just the living room right here. Lots of people came out to that conversation to listen to what we had to say. They're very interested in understanding what has happened in our communities. They're very interested in understanding the history of our communities, and they're very deeply engaged in wanting to be a part of that conversation. So I think it's something that we really need to make sure that we actually embrace and follow up. There was a lot of conversation about the history of our schools. The conversation was about our schools. It was about how do we get the best kinds of teachers possible into the schools into the north that are trained to understand that the history, not only the history, but what they're going to encounter there on their own behalf when it comes to the isolation factor. Many of the teachers I worked with up there left the community not because they didn't care about the children, not because they didn't care about teaching, but because they were daunted by the experience of living in a community like many of you live in on a regular basis and have left. So we're preparing those teachers, and last night that was the pitch. How do we get the best teachers possible into our communities? So for me, a beginning question as we move forward to implement the calls for action put forward by the TRC is what challenges do we face within our own communities and how can they be overcome? It's a conversation that I want to have at a more close and personal level with a lot of you in this room. And an opening statement as we move forward to implement the calls for action put forward by the TRC and by the invitation offered by the Minister of Indigenous Affairs yesterday will contain what are our strengths and the many incredible successes that we've generated over the course of time, the power in our resistance, and the love in our families. So there's a question and there's a statement that we have to make, because it's a statement that sometimes gets left aside when we're in conversations about what do we need to do to help our communities thrive more in this day and age. But we are sitting here, we've come here, we've gotten to the places where we are because of the successes that we've had. And I really try to drive that home when I'm out there talking to people. I don't want you to come into this room with this attitude that these poor people need this and that and the other. I want you to come in the room saying, wow, in the face of incredible odds, this is what these communities have managed to achieve, and these are the people that are out there doing this incredible work. And there have been many people before us that have fought this fight and have done an incredible job of getting us here where we are. So I think that that's important. So the navigating and addressing of this internal knowledge, it feels far more important than anything else we might look to for others to do or assist us with. We have to do it. Engaging each other in our homes, communities, and across organizational settings in a very real way remains a significant challenge. You heard it yesterday. The effects of long-standing silos in our organizations, our politics, and even in our personal relationships have been tremendous and have affected our ability to interact with each other well and to trust each other. However, we now have to move forwards towards deeper engagement and conversations within the entire Indigenous community and include our academic community. We have increasingly got people in our academic community who are wanting to get into this conversation. For a long time it was sort of them and us. Now we need to be, it has to be about all of us. All ages, backgrounds, knowledge levels cannot help but inform changes necessary to update and innovate our relational process. We have to ask and listen to whatever everyone is right now and what will be our most conversation yet. Yesterday, you heard about the decisions being made by presidents of universities. Paul Martin talked about how many university professors across Canada are engaging in this conversation. They have, in fact, passed principles. They are passing protocols. They are saying clearly and unequivocally, yes, we want to be a part of this conversation. We want to contribute everything we possibly can. We are indigenizing our universities. We are decolonizing our conversations. Not that they necessarily know exactly what that means. But at least they're uptaking it and they're saying, yes, we're going to be doing this. It's important. The next couple days, the University of Saskatchewan is hosting a national forum entitled Building Reconciliation, Universities Answering the Call, the TRC's Calls to Action. And they're bringing in a lot of people, thought leaders, to have this conversation. So it's a conversation that's happening at a lot of different kinds of levels. It's a conversation that everyone in the room needs to be involved with, or at least understand that it is happening so that we will be able to move this piece forward in a very positive and good way. Yes, there are still challenges, and I'm very clear about that when I'm doing conversations in different places. Yes, we have all these success. I want to focus there, but we still have challenges in our communities. But what an opportunity, because people in many places are ready to engage with us on those challenges. And I guess I tell students, we have to see it this way. Uptaking opportunity is what got us here, and it will get our children there. Wherever the there is, that we determine it to be. And that's where we're at today. It's not about somebody else telling us where we're going to go. We now have the wherewithal, have had it all along, actually, to be able to do that ourselves. So we know there's been enough talk in some very critical places, and it's time for action. Keeping in mind that in some instances, the only way to get information and knowledge moving into the community, political or academic process is to mobilize and support the necessary learning yourself. So the call for action is also about us actually uptaking and using the histories in our communities, knowing about everything about our treaties, because we're all going to be on call for answering this information. We cannot leave it to some of the scholars that have been writing about us for a long time, or some of the politicians that have finally started to learn a little bit about it. It's up to us. To activate the 94 TRC calls for action, reactivate the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. 20 years ago, that piece of work was done before some of the people in this room were born. It languished on the shelves. It has to be reactivated. We have to pull it forward. There was a lot of very powerful information in that piece of work, and we need to look at it. We need to move the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Rights from 2010 from an inspirational document to fully implemented, and we need to provide that knowledge and assistance without judgment. We are the ones that need to do that, and we need to be reminded that there's 2 million Indigenous people in this country. There's 32 million other people here, and we need those people behind us to get this thing going. We have an extremely loud voice in this country. We have an extremely loud voice because we have the Constitution, the repatriated Constitution 1982, which says that our rights are to be protected and to be respected. We have Supreme Court decisions that have come down, and since I started living, that we never had case law in this country till probably about 25 years ago. We have an incredible amount of case law that tells Canada what it has to do. So we need to do that. One of the calls for action, number 45, calls for a jointly developed Royal Proclamation of Reconciliation. It's to be issued by the Crown, and it would be something that would certainly provide guidance for not only Indigenous peoples, but all Canadians as we frame a new relationship. We need to be at the table. If we're going to be doing a Royal Proclamation of Reconciliation, that should be our conversation. It doesn't need to be handed down like the other Royal Proclamation was. So we need to talk about that. Call for action 53 asks for the establishment of a National Council for Reconciliation. Important because we need to create, support, and retain allies. Someone has to take the lead and stand as ambassadors for reconciliation. There were about 90 honorary witnesses appointed by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I'm one of them. They are across the country. Chuck Strahl, for those of you that know about Ministers of Indian Affairs, was also appointed an honorary witness. And at a meeting of honorary witnesses, Chuck Strahl said, exactly how long are we going to be honorary witnesses for? And they said, for the rest of your life. And he was like, oh. So it's a big responsibility. It means that from now forward, everybody that was appointed in that role will be having these conversations across the country and asking you to join that conversation and be a part of it. We're not doing it on your behalf. The idea is that we do it with you, that you be a part of that conversation. So it's not going to be enough for us to say you must learn about and integrate Indigenous knowledge and cultural mores into your universities and into your learning institutes of all kinds, and then stand by and watch people struggle to decide for themselves what is essential and what is not. It is really up to us to make those kinds of decisions. I had a conversation with an elder at the University of Manitoba, and they're talking about indigenizing the academy. And she said to me, Cynthia, are you asking us to bring ceremony into the university? Are you asking us to bring teachings into the university. And I said, no, we're not asking you to bring anything into the university that you don't feel is appropriate to bring here. There are occasions when ceremony at the university is appropriate, but you will make the decision on when that might be. What we're asking is for the proper and full history of this country, the other side of the history that was sort of pushed aside, to be brought into the university so that our children and your children and other people's children will understand the foundations of this country from the truth, not just about his story, as we all call it, his story, but it'll be more than that. We've asked for a nation-to-nation relationship, and the new government of Canada has agreed. Therefore, providing the kind of knowledge required and supported by the Indigenous community is and will continue to be essential. How will we do this? Yesterday, we had conversations in here about how we would implement some of the conversations on education. It's going to be very critical for us to speak up and be able to provide that information in as positive way as possible. And we have to teach our kids. You know, here in Thunder Bay, I have a lot of people at Lakehead. I had a student come in, an Indigenous student come in. Her child is at one of the schools here, and she came in and she said, you know, yesterday my child was taught the Columbus story. We've all had the Columbus story, right? Sailed the ocean blue, you know, discovered Canada. Maybe it's a little bit different in this country. And she said, my child called the teacher a liar. And I said, oh, okay, well, we don't want to be calling teachers liars, okay? So here's my suggestion. You go back to talk to that teacher, and you say the Columbus story is a story. And here's 3 creation stories that you can also offer your students to show them that one story is not the whole story of this continent. And I said, that way, you know, you're providing something that we need to have them have, and it's done in a good way, and they're not going to reject it. Another parent talked about how her child was told to do a paper on the Dark Ages. And she said, okay, so go back and ask your teacher, are we talking about the Dark Ages in Europe, or are we talking about something else? And he said, you know, Mom, do you have to politicize everything? So he went back and said, you know, is this about Europe and all that? And then he came back and said to his mom, yes, it's about Europe. And she said, you go back and tell your teacher that just because it was the Dark Ages in Europe doesn't mean it was the Dark Ages everywhere else on this planet. So it's important that we have those conversations and our kids are cued to the idea that they're being colonized. Our kids are being colonized right now in the schools because of the curriculum that they're being taught, the curriculum that we were taught. And we have an opportunity here to change that curriculum to be more important and responsive to us. So we have to make a formal and inclusive case for change. And so what does that mean? So we have to confront our own realities. We have to understand what is happening in our communities. We have to speak to it more effectively, and we have to speak to each other. Yeah, I heard yesterday, you know, that there's lots of things going on across the country. There's lots of tables being set on a variety of issues, but they're not necessarily talking to each other. So part of my job is to know what's happening on education tables across the country and say, okay, so, you know, you guys are doing this in Alberta, you guys are doing this in Ontario, and you guys are doing this in Northwest Territories. Can we bring this table together? Can we all speak to each other about what's happening in the communities and what it is we want to achieve? Because there's a really strong need, and Mr. Martin spoke to that yesterday, that if we don't come forward with a plan for action that is viable with all of the associated pieces, whether it's about cost or whether it's how we're going to do this in our schools, then they're not going to be able to do anything. And he's right, we have about 3.5 years, you know, to really make this happen. Right now, the entire province is red. And the Liberal provincially and federally, we have an opportunity here to make this happen. So we have to confront our own realities, and we have to be sure that we're speaking to each other. We also have to demonstrate positive and powerful faith that it can be done. And I know that that's one of the most difficult things that we're confronted with, because for so long we've been told that it can't be done, or that we can't do it, or that we don't have the capacity. You know, Alika LaFontaine spoke last night. He's a doctor. He said in grade 4, he was told by his teachers, he said, and, you know, maybe they were, you know, trying to be nice, you know, like they thought they were doing the right thing, and his principal, that he was developmentally challenged. And they told his parents that he would never amount to anything, and he'd probably never even be able to live on his own because of his mental deficiencies. And his parents cried because they had many hopes for their son, just like many of you do. He's a doctor today. The man, he's amazing. So that's what happens, right? So we have to make sure we demonstrate positive and powerful faith that it can be done. And I know it can be done because I've watched many, 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 many people do this. In 2006, the statistics told us that we had 1,100 PhDs graduated in every field. We had 7,000 master's degrees graduated in every field, and we had over 30,000 undergraduates graduated in every field possible. That was in 2006, almost 10 years ago. So I can assure you we've done a lot better than that up to this point. So we can do that. We also have to provide that clear and accessible roadmap. We have to be able to do that. And I don't know how we're going to do that, but I'll tell you, it's going to be really important for us to sit down at tables like this and map that out. One of the things I suggested, and actually Alico did this with doctors across Canada, he said they just put up huge charts across the walls. And they didn't have speakers, and that's what we're going to do with this next education meeting. They just gave everybody a marker, and they said, okay, let's go for it. Let's talk about where we've been and what we wanted to do. Let's talk about where we are, and let's talk about where we're going. And let's assign somebody to it. Let's get it done. So they're actually doing that. The Aboriginal physicians are working on that to make that happen. We can do that too, whether it's about education or self-government or whatever it is. We need to do that. We need to have those, and you all need to be involved. You all need to have a pen in your hand, because it is not only the purview of our leadership to make those decisions on our behalf. Yes, we put them in those positions to be able to carry those messages forward, but they have to carry messages forward that come from us and take it to the right places. So we need to do that. Ask yourself what your practice is now, and go inclusive. Go inclusive. Even if it means holding your nose until it feels right, because if we're not working together, we're not working well. And it's a message that I've brought to Thunder Bay. I truly believe in working with other people in every capacity. I don't like silos. I don't like people being separated. We have to do this together. And honestly, I don't care what your background is. Let's just do it together. Speak and attend conversations. Learn to speak and your mind. I listen to people get up and talk at the mics, and I say bravo to you, because that's an important consideration. You would not believe it, but until I was 16 years old, I never said a word. Okay, because I came out of a family situation like many of us have, with residential school survivors as parents, lots of domestic violence, lots of sexual violence, lots of the kinds of things that I had to navigate as a single child, and it was always better to be invisible. I had to learn how to speak. I did a speaking engagement in California when I was about 23. And I walked into this room, and in those days it was all old white guys that were teachers. No offense to any of the old white guys in the room. And I looked at them, and they looked at me, and I looked at them, and they looked at me, and I walked out of the room. I couldn't say anything. I walked out of the room, and I said, this will never happen to me again. This will never happen to me again. I came back to Canada. I joined Toastmasters. We now have Toastmasters at Lakehead for our kids. And I learned to speak. And 10 years later, I was at Western University doing a talk on treaties. And this man walked up to me and shook my hand, and he said, congratulations. And I said, oh, you like the talk? He said, yeah, the talk was great. He said, I was there 10 years ago. So we learn. You will learn. Schedule and attend conversations. Do lunch and learns, guest speakers, student projects, mentorship and tutoring, accepting invitations to speak to classes. Go to the Rotary clubs, the police, the judiciary. Talk to the kids and teenagers on your block and in your neighborhood if they're visiting your kids. It's the only way we can get this done. And we have to strike while the iron is hot, which is right now. Right now, people are open to this. We've just had 7 years of truth. Very challenging for people to come and listen to the truth. So we had a lot of difficulty getting the Canadian population into the room because the truth hurts. It hurts us too. It hurts us when we have to identify certain kinds of truths. But now we're talking about reconciliation. We're talking about people taking action. We're talking about people being of assistance, and people are coming forward, people in very high places. Share your knowledge in a friendly and therefore likely to be well-received way. I know we've been asked a gazillion times the same questions over and over again. Don't get offended. Even yesterday on the flight down with Paul Martin, he said to me, you don't look like an Indian. What does an Indian look like? Don't get offended. I'm like, that's okay that you asked me, and let me explain that for you. So, give it to them in the way that's going to be received. Attend and even create things like the Meet Me at the Bell Tower. In Winnipeg, they created, Michael Redhead Champagne created a very successful community strategy to reduce violence in North Winnipeg. It's called Meet Me at the Bell Tower. They've been running that thing for 4 years. Every Friday night, they meet at the Bell Tower, and all the kids in the neighborhood come, and a lot of other people attend this. They were able to reduce neighborhood violence by 18% to the city's 3%. Because where were all the kids? At the Bell Tower. So, and that doesn't cost anything. And he said he thought maybe nobody would show up, and the first night they did it in a snowstorm, they had 40 kids show up. Kids want to be engaged. They want to be a part of the conversation. They want to be here. And he brought the North End youth into a self-motivated club. We need to do this too. I've listened to people from the North say, kids say, you know what, the thing that got me sober and kept me straight was we started a youth council. And I got involved in the conversation, I got involved in the politics, I got involved in the community events. Give your kids something to connect to, and they will do better. The club's name is SHIT. So why, right? You want to ask me why? Well, he said they wanted to deal with the stereotypes that create judgment against them. So yes. They wanted to address the hypocrisy inherent in a society that speaks from two sides of its proverbial mouth and lies in the middle. And he wanted to talk about the institutions, whether educational or otherwise, that negatively impact their lives on a daily basis. And finally, they wanted to return to the teachings. Shit. It's worked very well. Give your kids the opportunity to gather and support them because they need you. They need your social capital, they need your knowledge, they need all those pieces. In 2012, the Brown Canada Project was launched by the Council of Agencies Serving South Asians in Toronto. It became a 2-year community-led project aimed at documenting, creating, and sharing diverse South Asian histories and experiences in Canada. This isn't a going concern. Participants described a spirit injury associated with migration. This spirit injury was simultaneously comprised of a sense of hope coupled with a sense of emptiness, and participants described the hope that they had for education, for jobs, and for better opportunities in Canada. They also shared the spiritual impacts of having to start over, leaving everything behind, including family, and having to adjust and assimilate to life in Canada. These impacts are experienced in multifaceted ways, including a sense of dislocation, nostalgia for being back home, and the struggles to build a new life. Participants described the injuries associated with systemic racism and the lack of recognition of value of their education, of their professional credentials, for us would be traditional knowledge, and their personal experiences and skills. Does that sound familiar to you? Based on this conversation and research, what do we have to learn from each other as a people coming from other countries and from our own remote and reserve-based communities? There's no difference in that conversation that many of the kids that I've talked to have said to me. They experienced the same spirit injury as other people coming to this country do in this country, and so we need to be aware of that. We need to help work with them on it. So it's an opportunity also to create alliances and ambassadors in a diversity of places. And I've been approached already by people who are working in Black Lives Count and said, hey, you know, we're doing the same thing, we got the same questions, we got the same concerns. Is it possible for us to work together? Can we come to the same table? And the Muslim community has also asked me the same thing. Is it possible for us to have a conversation in this country together at a round table that's where we can share this and we can figure out how we can do this and we can work this out together? So we need to find allies or create allies across the province and ultimately across the entire country because we've got much to offer and there's a call for our voices to be raised together. And what better way to create allies than to engage every other community seeing itself as marginalized, inviting them into the larger conversation. This is what Idle No More was all about. It wasn't just us. It became a movement because people joined in, danced with us, supported us, and created a huge momentum, which more recently manifested itself as Rock the Vote. Rock the Vote. For a city accused of being the most racist in Canada, they sure generate a lot of great ideas internal to the community. So we can overcome challenges by reframing them from a negative to a positive. Every single Indigenous person who has come through as an educational and ultimately college or university system has added to the conversation, has challenged the barriers, and has made a contribution to where we find ourselves today. We need to always remember that. So it needs to go like this, something like this. Every First Nation, Métis, and Inuit community in Canada needs to relearn and speak their histories and their languages to their kids from birth onwards. It comes from the household. The Innu people said to me, Cynthia, one of the ways that we strengthened our language was we agreed as a community that no child would be able to enter kindergarten unless they were fluent in the language. That meant that all of the parents had to reconstitute their language skills themselves so that their kids were fluent enough to get into school, and they have completely revitalized their language. Yes, they teach it in the school. They go up to a certain grade in only Innu, but it took the households to make it happen. The Cherokee Nation has revitalized their language. But probably 2 years ago now, maybe 3, they graduated their first junior high school class fully fluent in Cherokee and English. And now they're going into the universities, and they're creating that kind of a combination. So they were able to do that. So that's what we need to do. The students need to start the conversations. Teachers and instructors, university presidents are doing it. Politicians, administrators, and faculty and other people that need to do that. So we need to, when we're talking about Indigenous knowledge, we need them to know that we're talking about inclusion of a full and proper true history, treaty relations, the promises, UNDRIP, RCAP, the TRC, the truth across all curriculum programs and faculties, and we must all be putting forward the need for reorganization and recognition and the total restoration of our languages across Canada. And Dr. Bennett talked about that yesterday. We need to be able to ensure that it happens. Prepare to be called upon, and don't be afraid to be regarded as the local expert. You'll probably learn a great deal through your own public speaking and from the many conversations you can generate across the board. There are 4 calls for action only that address what we as Indigenous peoples need to do and contribute. Number 57, 86, 92.3, and 93. And those are the only ones that actually really ask the Indigenous community itself to be a part of this conversation. So we need to do that. And there's many more calls for action that engage the child, welfare, of peoples, the churches, educational institutions, governments, etc. We need to put down the need to be right in this instance, or for anyone else to be wrong. Be mindful of the stereotyping that can occur, provocative language, and forget about sending any kind of blame in any direction. No matter what has happened, what can happen in the future is where we want to focus. We can't change the past. We can only change how we address the needs and wants of those and for the future of our kids, Canada's children, and ensure compelling and inclusive education for everybody, including other peoples. Teach people the language of reconciliation and walk the talk yourself. Build bridges inside your primary, secondary, and alternative post-secondary institutions by engaging all students from all backgrounds and all programs, and by reaching outside your own normal circles to the high schools and local alternative educational programs around you. Invite them in. They need to be a part of this conversation. It's all good. If we work hard to make it so, and ask yourself, where will we be tomorrow and the day after that? Never doubt that we can change the world. We've just witnessed a red tsunami as people in this country, including ours, voted out Harper, and even when they had to hold their noses to vote Liberal, or it was the first time pitch for them, they did it. We saw people vote in almost every single community. Know what we can do, because we've seen what we can do together. We have an Indigenous woman as our Minister of Justice. Who ever expected to see this happen in our lifetime? I was told when I was a young girl, when I first started doing this kind of work, that I would probably never see the fruits of my labor in my lifetime. They said, do it anyway, because it's necessary. We never expected to see what we're seeing today. We have the power. We've always had the power. We're here today because our ancestors, in spite of huge odds against them, survived, and now we must manifest our power in a conscious manner, so we will too, but not only survive, we need to thrive. Believe and reconstitute the stories that sustain and grew our ancestors into positive survivors, warriors, and ask yourself, and make this relevant to your youth as well. And this is a deeply personal question. Ask yourself, what is the story you're telling yourself and each other, and therefore passing on to your children and those around you? Finally, accept and do not deny that we have a lot of work to do if we are to be the leaders who take this world back to the land, to protection of the waters, and to a sustainable worldview, as the 7 fires prophecy have suggested. We've ignited the 8th fire. They are in your homes, your schools, and living amongst you. They are determined, and so should we be, to use this time we find ourselves in to be totally effective. Now is when our ancestors' dreams are unfolding. It has only taken us 600 years to get here, but we've seen without a doubt that it can happen. So we need to dig deeper, reach further, and be that much more honest with ourselves and with each other. We have to put down those things that can damage our futures. We have to address those concerns in our communities and help to mitigate them. And we have to intervene where it makes sense and remember who we truly are, because nothing else will get us where we need to go. You know, and I know that the time is now. Thank you.
Thanks to Cynthia, and we actually have a Q&A at this time. So if any of you had questions, just make your way to either mic and state your name and your community. And we have until 9:45 until we move on to our second panel. So if anyone had questions, please make your way to the mic for Cynthia.
I rushed through because I thought we were like, get off the stage. Okay, I'm trying to hurry.
So name and community, please.
Bonjour. News way to morgan is not in cause. Bonjour, ne dodom. I'm really glad to hear you talk. I've listened to you talk. I've met you at the Wesley United
Yeah.
when you did the call for action for the TRC. Reality. We talk about reality. Lateral violence is a big reality that needs to be educated, that needs to be taught to our chiefs, to our hierarchy, as well as our children and our youth. To understand what lateral violence is, when we do it to ourselves, when we Native people do it to our own Native people, we are doing that and it's becoming stronger. We are oppressing our young ones. Some people have grown greedy. We don't talk about that. We don't talk about the 7 deadly sins. We always talk about the 7 sacred teachings. What are they? I've never heard them mentioned once here yesterday. We don't acknowledge those enough as leaders. We need to talk about it. We need to live it, as was what we were talking about yesterday, walking the talk, living it. Because our people are still sleeping outside in the streets. We have shelter houses. We have women crisis homes where women are not being able to access these programs that are put there. They're being rejected. They're not being allowed in. Treatment programs are being cut 3 weeks from a 6-week program to people who are on opiates. When I talk like this, I don't like talking to white people about our Native issues, about our Native problems. Police brutality. How can we get educated if we don't have a place to go and complain to? If we don't have the support given? Because it's too much paperwork? Or we just don't care anymore? Oh no, we care. I know, I experience it. I live it. The respect of the food situation. How can we educate our children, our youth, our people, if our people are starving? And that's a reality. We have so much strong people out there in the community, in our communities, that are struggling to try and fight for their children. And yet our people, our own people, are allowing these women, these families, these parents to continue to fight for their children while their children are being abused in foster homes, physically, sexually, mentally, being shamed because of who we are, because of who they are. That's a reality. We need to start stepping up.
Yeah, actually, you're out, and people are stepping up, and they are working on those pieces. I mean, that's why Cindy Blackstock has launched this human rights piece against the government for inequity in childcare. There are a lot of really good people working very, very hard to make those changes. But I acknowledge that it is going to take everybody. Nobody can bystand on this anymore. And there are a lot of people that are stepping up to the plate to try to make those changes. And it has changed. It has changed from the time that I was born and the experiences that my parents had, as direct residential school survivors, to where we are. The lateral violence is something that we are aware of. And I think people are increasingly acknowledging that it is really up to us to have those conversations. And I agree with you that the conversations need to happen, and that, but I'm not going to come up and say, we get that there's sexual violence in our communities, there's domestic violence in our communities. You're absolutely correct. And there are a lot of people here that are working very hard to try to change those kinds of things. We live the 7 teachings. We articulate those to our children, and they are more familiar with that than many of us as adults are, because they are taught that. They are taught that. They're there. That's what Idle No More was all about. So we need to be softer. We need to be kinder with each other. We need to understand that, yes, there are hungry people. There will always be hungry people. What can we do right now to make sure that we mitigate that? The other day, we asked students to come forward. We had a conversation on the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation and the records and the files that are there that detail what our communities have gone through over the course of time. I asked students in Lakehead if they would step forward to talk about intergenerational effect, because that's what you're talking about, is the continuing legacy of the violence that was visited against our parents and our grandparents and all the way back for many generations. I had 7 students step forward. But here's the thing about those 7 students. They stepped forward courageously, so that's one of our teachings, to share their truth, which is another one of our teachings, with great humility and respect, which are 2 more of our teachings. And what they expressed was some real honesty about their experiences growing up in families that were impacted by residential schools. And they talked about the love that they have for their children and the differences they've done and the changes they've made in their own lives in spite of suffering from sexual violence, in spite of suffering from alcohol addiction in themselves and their parents. And they moved themselves through, and the entire population that was attending, we had 76 people attend that, including grandmothers. They got to wisdom because they said, in spite of all of the damages that were done, in spite of the pain that my parents sometimes caused me, I've learned that the way to make it possible to move forward in this world is to find the love and to find the forgiveness and to understand that what I bring into this is what's going to continue to cause problems. So they had their children, some of them had their children there. So there's some very powerful movement going on in our communities that are addressing the very things that you're talking about. There were police there as well. There were non-Native people there. There were grandmothers there that said they had never really heard about this stuff. So the changes are being made. We can't get farther by being angry with each other, though. Let me just say that very clearly and unequivocally. That we will do more and have done more in our communities to make the changes that are necessary by reaching out in compassion. I asked yesterday a lady, a very wealthy woman, and I said, you people here that have all this resource, ask us what you can do. You say, it's going to cost a lot of money, it's going to cost a lot of this, it's going to cost a lot of that. And I just went over to this lady. Why? I shook her hand. I said, how much did that cost you? She said, it didn't cost me anything. That's all you need to do is reach out your hand in friendship and reach out your hand in love, and people will respond and will help do what's necessary. So, I appreciate your comments. I really do. And I think that it's really important as a woman that you raise your voice. But I'm going to ask you that when you raise your voice, you raise it in kindness and understand that all of the people that are sitting in this room are here very specifically because they know that something has to be done, and they've been doing it, probably most of them, looking around the room, most of their lives. And it's a big job. It's a big, big, big job. It took us 600 years to get here. I don't anticipate that in the next 4 years we're going to solve all the problems, although Paul Martin and I tried to do that yesterday on the plane. So thank you so much.
Just one more thing. Okay, so you task me to be more kind. It's pretty hard. I mean, I'm grassroots.
Yeah,
I am
I know.
grassroots. I live it.
Yeah.
I see it.
Yeah, I
Okay,
know.
I see the police violence. I see the rapes. I see the beatings.
Yeah.
I see the people getting, drugs, drinking,
Yeah.
watching them deteriorate.
Yeah.
I lived that. I was a part of that,
Yeah.
just like you were.
Yeah.
You know, you came from domestic violence as well, but I was a part of it.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you reach those people?
Well-
you know, after being rejected for so many times, over and over, and then they give up. How do you get them back? We have way too many people that are down there that don't believe us anymore.
Yeah. Well, you're doing the work on the street that is absolutely essential, and I want to thank you for that, because a lot of us don't get the opportunity to do that work, which doesn't mean that the work that every one of you in this room is doing is not incredibly valuable. We just have to make sure that we have time at every table for those realities. And I said that, we have to confront our own realities. We have to know that things are happening that are not easy to solve. It's a big conversation. It's bigger than most people are aware of. And when you have the kind of perspective that you get traveling coast to coast, talking to so many people, you realize that. So let's just keep going. Let's keep helping. Let's walk those teachings and understand that the only way we're going to get to where we need to go is by ensuring that we enliven those teachings in each one of our lives. So thank you so much this morning.
So,